So my guest, Ali Sethi over here, he grew up in Lahore like me. Then he went to Harvard for his undergrad and majored in South Asian studies. His novel, The Wishmaker, came out in 2009. He's written for The New Yorker, NY Times, New York Times, Caravan, etc. He was formerly apprenticed to Master Moin at age 17, then to Ustad Nasiruddin Sassami at age 24 in 2008. He's also practiced Bandish and Ghazal music with Farida Khanam rigorously for the last 4 years. He made his singing debut on the soundtrack of The Reluctant Fundamentalist in 2013, and subsequently his Coke Studio debut on season 8, where he then performed on 5 subsequent seasons of Coke Studio. Last year, he was a soloist at Carnegie Hall, where he sang 2 classical ragas. And for the last year and a half, he's been making original music, staying within the raga and tasawwuf traditions with Grammy winner Noah Georgeson. I want to get a sense of your trajectory from both, keeping music and writing in your life as through lines through your work, and also to the present, you're making original music and you've been releasing it through this year, and how that process has been.
I've never really thought of literature and music as 2 separate things, which I probably should do because it's useful. It helps you introduce yourself more lucratively to people who can then see what you do and how they can help you do what you do. I think hyphenated descriptions of one's sort of life and vocation are generally less helpful. But I think that I have had this kind of, I've had music and literature be welded in my imagination since I was very little, because I think that's the kind of mahal I grew up in Lahore. So much Punjabi literature and Urdu literature is passed on orally because it resides in couplets, and it resides in kafis, and it resides in qawwalis and in those things, right? And it's stuff stretching all the way back to the early medieval period. And you certainly, when I was growing up in the 1990s, you would see it on TV from morning till night. Everything from sort of Abida Parveen and who I then later sang with, and then Nusrat Saab and Noor Jahan, and you would see Zehra Nigar reciting Amir Khusro, and then Ghalib, and then Faiz, and I was very aware of all of this, or doubly aware of all of this, because my father was a book publisher. My father ran Avant-Garde books, where I remember there was always this edition of the Faiz volume that Avant-Garde published, Victor Kiernan's translations of Faiz, that would be lying around. So those were my toys when I was a kid. I would play with those books, and I would hide behind those books, bookshelves and bookstalls in the bookstore when my parents would be upstairs working, and my sister and I would play among the books. So that idea was it was a world that was very amorphous in a good way. It all sort of resided together, and I intuitively knew as a kid that music was a zariya, was a kind of way of articulating so much philosophy, so much epistemology, so much sort of these other words that I then acquired later, worldviews, sensibilities, outlooks, attitudes. These things got articulated through this combine of language and music. And I was always very interested I was performing it since I was a kid, because that's just the kind of kid I was. But I was always interested in kind of, getting to the bottom of it, figuring out the grammar of it, figuring out the origins of it, the intention behind these things. I remember being in a car with my parents driving from Lahore to Nathia Gali, those long drives, which would be like 7 hours at a stretch, and just listening to these Nusrat Saab qawwalis on the way. My sister and I would be sort of half asleep at the back, and we'd be listening to these qawwalis, and I would always wonder, in fact, after I'm done with this conversation with you, I'm going to go and record the qawwali Aaj Rang Hai. Do you mind if I give you some demonstrations? I have a keyboard with me. I think it helps to...
That'll be fun. Yeah.
Okay, great. So this is I call it my Chotu Yamaha keyboard. It's been my Bure Waqton Ka Dost, my fellow traveler in the era of COVID-19, when I have been unable to do live performances with my band. So Can you hear this?
Yes, I can.
So, Aaj Rang Hai, which is in the Khosravi tradition that we will get to in a bit. I would listen to this, a 30-minute like live rendition of this Qawwali, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and party. Yeah. And I would always kind of, I guess, fixate on the improvisations. I would always want to know how these people randomly took off, went sort of, did these seemingly spontaneous glides and jumps and improvised arias, and then came back to the verse, back to the chorus. So आज रंग है रे माँ रंग है रे आज रंग है रे माँ रंग है रे, and then now I can do this because I know what's going on here. I know what raga space I'm in. I know what the theka, what the tabla tal is. I know how to do half time. I know what the matra, what the time signature is. Just seeing how people would be, this completely disparate, class segregated, gender segregated, like otherwise totally unruly crowd just suddenly become charged and become cohering around his performance, and he would command them like a shaman. And I would think, screw ideas like nation and religion and whatever. This moment here, this is community. This is the sense of, this is a gathering, this mehfil, this is true, this is real. We all get to be our individual selves with our individual subjectivities, our particular narratives, without having to compromise any of our individuality. We get to participate together in this congregation. That was something that felt very special to me.
When you moved back to the US after the Wishmaker, you obviously were vocationally then training, in classical music. So in that sort of vocational shift, so there's first like the East-West dichotomy, right? Like you have this sort of like Western literary debutante, right? And then all of a sudden you pivot to...
It seems that way, Kamil, but if you think about it, see, I majored in South Asian studies, so I was already, as an undergraduate, really already immersing myself in the study of Ginans and of Qawwali and of Brij Bhasha and learning Devanagari and reading, Anne-Marie Schimmel and reading, Eaton, and Ali Asani was my mentor at college, and basically trying to understand the syncretic traditions. And I was also doing the equivalent of a minor in English. Around that time, so I didn't see the writing of a novel as a departure from this thing. It was a part of my world, and you're right. If I were slightly savvier, I would have stuck to a careerist sort of position on it. But I think also what happened was, if I can be honest with you, I published my book when I was 23 years old. So I which at that time felt to me like I'd waited my whole life to do this, but like in retrospect, it's a very raw and young age at which to publish a novel. And I did that, and then immediately felt that I had to write another. But then hadn't really, to put it sort of summarily for you, I hadn't really reckoned with myself or with where I came from or what my sort of particular background or personal story was. I hadn't even had those experiences. So I think that's why I wrote some journalism. I wrote some long form pieces. I wrote some, investigative stuff. I wrote some literary criticism. They all came out of really the hard labor of studying things and of traveling and of venturing out. Like this longer piece that I published in the Times. I don't know if they ever published a 3,000 word op-ed before, which is actually a postcard from this flooded village in Balochistan. It's just something that I happened to go and see, like I happened to be in it. My optional visa expired when I, like 1 year after I graduated. And the only way at that time that you could stay on in the US, I'm sure it continues to be true, was that, you have to do a job in finance, which I didn't want to do. I didn't want to become a consultant. I mean, many of my international student friends, most of them, in fact, had to do that in order to stay on.
And I want to talk about, the ghazal and the rag as forms that are, this very obvious elephant in the room for a society such as Pakistan that I feel in the past 2 decades, at least since 9/11, at least as far as I can remember, has really been undergoing this process of Arabization. And the ghazal and the rag sort of form an oppositional challenge to it in some way. But the question that I'm wondering about is, first, is the syncretism and challenge to nationalism that the form poses, is that still as potent as it has been historically, or do you think it's been
Yeah, in
defined?
fact, that's a great question. I think, in fact, the way I like to use it, I mean, and my marshalling of it, but also the way that I experience it, I find that precisely what you say, the ghazal originated in Arabia in the 8th century AD. So the ghazal is already an Arab form. I mean, this is the funny stuff, right? Is that in order to retrieve a legitimate cosmopolitanism, we do have to still go back into a sort of medieval multicultural moment, right? I think that, the contemporary idea of Arab, which flourishes and thrives in Pakistan, which is a Saudi Wahhabi narrow mutation, if you ask me. It's not even, it's not backed by, forget civilizational weight. It's not even backed by like time. It's only like 40, 50 years old, this particular model of it, Whereas the ghazal has been in what is present day Pakistan for at least 400 years, if not longer. Yeah. Right? And similarly with the raga, people think of rag as an Indian thing or like as a Hindu thing. These are also constructs. Rag is a Sanskrit word which just means sound or voice. If you think about particular ragas, like Bhairavi, they correspond exactly with Arabic maqam, right? So you can actually, it's precisely what you hear in the azan gets transmuted in another melody on Coke Studio the same night, and you don't even know it, but you're actually experiencing the same melodic framework in a slightly transposed sort of key.
Obviously, you've made your mark with the ghazals and rags, and I want to know how well they function as a vehicle for history in a sort of didactic sense, right? Like in the sort of sense that you're actually teaching people about something that they have been surrounded by their whole lives, but have really fully, taken in the historicity of.
Well, I think one thing that we do need to keep in mind is that in the last 30 years, Ghazal has definitely moved away from a kind of centrality that it enjoyed in the popular musical landscape of South Asia, of India and Pakistan in particular, but also diaspora. In the 1980s, you had singers like Jagjit Singh, Pankaj Udhas, etc., who were following in the footsteps of the great Pakistani Ghazal singers like Iqbal Bano, Mehdi Hasan, Farida Khanum, Noor Jahan, etc. So the 70s and 80s were kind of the high point of the Ghazal revival in the subcontinent. And then you have through the 90s when Qawwali and the really percussive forms start to take over, you have the Ghazal becomes kind of marginal and people move away from it, right? What's interesting for me is that the Ghazal helps me be a bit of a revisionist, right? It allows me to bring in all these perspectives via this slightly marginal form that are multicultural, that are very comfortably polyvalent, right? So the idea that within a single ghazal you have the Arifana, you have the sort of, in the traditional Ibn Arabi sense, you have the metaphysical sort of spiritual quest, the cosmic, if you will, dimension. And then you have the sort of subversive, profane, naughty, kind of corporal, sensual dimension, which is very important, and which also has, queer elements and homoerotic elements. We'll get to that. But then via Faiz and co, you also have this social and socialist critique of power structures of the state, of imperialism, etc. So the ghazal is really really useful for this moment that we are living in, I find. Because through its veils and metaphors and ambiguities, it allows me to simultaneously evoke not only these marginal histories or these denied histories, right, or these buried histories that have been deliberately sidelined in Pakistan and now are being sidelined in India as well, very violently and kind of, grossly. But also, the Ghazal allows me to be creative. It allows me to create new meanings. I mean, the visual for, say, a video like Chandni Raat, which is a traditional formal Ghazal, lyrically and also in the musical composition of it. The video is very contemporary and sort of feels dystopian. And Sarmat Khusert and Awais Kohar, who directed the video, I think made this really radical decision. I've never seen a ghazal done like that before. I mean, and it wasn't my idea; it was their idea. To kind of have this abstract, sort of almost theatrical space, which just happens to be the greenhouse in the Punjab University campus. But turn it into this kind of space of transit, this deliberately ambiguous space that is open to interpretation, and have it peopled with, an ethnic Hazara woman, a transgender person, two boys whose relationship is one of affection and intimacy. We don't know exactly what the nature of it is. A child and an older person, and then they're the kind of dynamic they have as a crowd or as a mehfil, right? So we really, I think we took the tradition of it, stayed within the ambit of the tradition, within the lyric and within the musicality of it, and then added this visual component to it that was totally outside the tradition. So I think working in that kind of space I find helpful because, and I'll tell you a little anecdote, something that happened. We released it on, I think, the 13th of February last year, and we didn't know that 3 days later there would be this, face-off between the Indian and Pakistani militaries, and it happened, and you saw Indians and Pakistanis taking shelter under the Chandni Raat video, sort of saying, this is a safe space where we can still, at this time, retreat into love, as it were.
The first thing I want to talk about is the situation in terms of dissent right now, right? So one of the very interesting things that I find about political crackdowns on political dissent in countries, and this is obviously not just true in Pakistan, this is true for a lot of countries, is that there's almost always a crackdown on culture as well, and that extends to elite culture, right? So even within the canonical Marxist paradigm, you're going to have this twinned act of crushing labor and the working class with the crackdown of culture. And the argument there usually is that, because history, like academic history, for instance, or music and art are vehicles for working class sentiments, they must be cracked down upon. But I wonder to what degree that's true. And B, the thing that I'm wondering about, when we zoom out, is if today is a better or worse time for the Pakistani music industry and musical culture at large compared to decades prior.
Those, I think, are two related but separate questions. I mean, for the first question, look, I'll just tell you that I, for example, grew up, as I'm sure you did too, watching Nusrat Saab and Abida Parveen sing Bulle Shah, those really, really, in some ways, explosive verses, right? Masjid dhade, mandir dhade, dhade jo kuch dhanda. That you could say, if you said it without singing it, somebody would charge you with blasphemy, right? But if you sing it, I mean, in today's Pakistan, anybody can charge you with anything. But somehow Abida Parveen singing it with that authority that she has when she's on a stage, right? Where she transcends all these temporal, corporal boundaries that we otherwise hold very sort of rigidly in Pakistan. You see, an auditorium like the Gaddafi Stadium in Lahore with like 5,000 people. Nobody has the the ability to point a finger and say ye kufr hai or ye, because she's backed by the weight of culture, as it were, right? And I hope that doesn't change. I mean, it can always change. You can, like you can kill off Basant, you can kill off Sufi recital, and 10 years later there'll be a whole generation of people who grew up without ever having seen it and who will then say this is kufr and this is not on, beyond the pale, etc. But we certainly grew up with a continuity of that thing, which is kind of miraculous, because we are the post-Ziaul Haq generation, right, where everything was kind of banned in Pakistan. Anything that was mildly critical or potentially critical was banned. And yet you see someone like Abda Parveen, who's really a radical presence, I think, in the larger sort of South Asian popular imagination, thriving in that period and finding her voice in that period. I found that there's been, despite the sort of, rhetoric of the state and the mullah and the call it the Talibanization or whatever, which has happened. I mean, we saw it happen. It's happened in elite spaces in some ways. It happened at HSN College, where I had to read and recite those, textbooks in order to get ahead, in order to make the grade, in order to freaking get into an American college. I had to pass my Pak Studies in Islamia, exams. And that just meant reproducing word by word what the teacher made you memorize and recite. Otherwise you wouldn't make the grade. So everything from sort of HSN College to the local madrasa or the government school where you had to regurgitate these things, to watching Dr. Asrar Ahmed on TV. I don't subscribe to this idea that, for example, that Urdu is an elite language whereas Punjabi is a non-elite. I don't think those distinctions really apply anymore. They may have applied 40 years ago. But I think in a place like Pakistan, I think it's actually happily a much more mixed up sort of space now in the realm of culture.
What we're talking about over here is distinctions between, the respectable middle class elite, upper class elite family that's projected on an advertisement versus the decadent, but also the transgressive literati and socialite crowd that becomes a sort of vehicle for hatred and vitriol a lot of the time, and also unquestionably has power within the societal structure of Pakistan, right? So these people, like, this is also a funny anecdote, but and it'll segue into my next question. But there's a friend of mine, not a friend of mine, an acquaintance of mine from school, who was from a fairly wealthy background, and he was a party boy, and he applied for asylum to Canada on the basis that he is queer, and even though he's not. My knowledge, to the best of my knowledge, and I know fair amount about him. And I remember like feeling everybody around me had like obvious things about how unethical it was that he had lied about it in the first place. But my thing was, no, but it's even more objectionable because I'm not convinced. I would never do that because I'm not convinced that I wouldn't be safe, right, if I went back. And therefore, applying for asylum seems to me like lying about what the situation really is. Because, for the most part, I've lived fairly comfortably, right? But with you, I think, with your work and your prominence, and obviously the more famous you get, and also, should note, your father and your mother, the two of the most famous journalists in Pakistan, have had to deal with, exile and death threats, etc. And you've obviously talked about that.
Yeah.
Do you feel, firstly, this characterization of the elite, right, that we've been talking about, like how much does it really speak to, class difference, and how much do we really need to delve into that? But secondly, to your particular status, how dangerous do you feel what you're doing really is?
I don't think it's being, perceived as elite makes stuff more dangerous. I mean, look, I'll just give you an example. My friend Bilal Said, the singer, and my friend Sabah Kamar Zaman, the actor, they just made a video, music video. I'm sure you know about this, where Sabah is seen twirling a little bit in the Badshai Mosque, and lo and behold, they've been charged with this blasphemy case. There's nothing overtly elite about the gesture, right? Neither of them are accused of being, godless or whatever. In fact, I think they both made statements saying, declaring how devout they are and their beliefs and reiterating all of that stuff. But I mean, I think we need to step away from a theoretical framework for a moment, because I think theory really doesn't help us make sense of our world. I personally believe that, especially a place like Pakistan, I think, where, categories have been forcibly imposed on various segments of the population. People even subscribe nominally to ideas and to abstract identities that don't really match with their lived experience or with what they end up doing, right? I think that to just answer your question, I don't think you have to be elite to be vulnerable. I mean, that's like, I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't think that's the way the mob works in Pakistan or in India now anymore. I think that I would, in fact, like to answer your question with tradition. I want to talk about tradition, which I think is a more helpful category. I think that, and this also kind of addresses the Dil Lagaye thing, because you're right that while the Dil Lagaye video is set in an elite milieu in Lahore, in a kind of, sort of obviously bourgeois kind of environment where people dress a certain way and are comfortable hanging out with each other and dancing in this kind of smoky, repressed indoor space where you get to be free in a very like small, controlled environment. I think that's kind of true of a lot of places in the global South generally. I mean, I have friends who live in Latin America and who live in the Middle East who saw that video and were like, "Oh, this feels exactly like that city where I live or where I have happened to live in the past, etc." It's not just a Pakistan thing. In fact, most of the response to the Dil Lagaye video comes from India, from people who live in places like Mumbai and Delhi and Calcutta and other places, right? Where actually that setup feels in some ways more familiar, because that visual is less elite, I feel, because there's more people like that, just because there's more people who live dressed like that and live like that in India, or are publicly visible in that way, or don't perform, the head covered rich person sort of iconography. But to answer your question, the thing is, let's do a close reading of the Ghazal form. The Ghazal has always been a vehicle of subversive, radical ideas, right? So everybody from Mir Taqi Mir to Mirza Ghalib to even, national poet Allama Muhammad Iqbal, to all the way through then Faiz and onwards Nasir Kazmi, etc. Parveen Shakir, Malaka Bai, Chanda Bai, who I was reading 2 days ago, who's a 19th century, early 19th century, they call her a courtesan, but she's, a woman at the court of a local ruler. She's an independent woman who writes a ghazal and sings and dances to the ghazal as well. And she wrote these beautiful ghazals that I'm now putting to music. These are all people who've used metaphors like hijab, like the wine cup and the saki, the bearer of the wine, metaphors like wasl, union, and hijr, which is separation, to talk about such a wide range of potentially explosive subjects. Everything from, Ghalib making these, half agnostic, sort of God questioning verses. Na tha kuch to, na hota, main to kya hota, that whole sort of, really like in some ways subversive critique of the God concept, right, which Ghalib is doing in the 19th century. Iqbal saying, "Tere ishq ki intaha chahta hu," right? Meri sadgi dekh kya chahta hu. Intaha, there's a pun on intaha, which is I want to be full of the love of you, but also I want an end to this business, because intaha means the end of something. This is how most people. So Faiz, of course, playing with it really, really overtly to kind of inserting a totally communist share inside a ghazal saying, दोनों जहां तेरी मोहब्बत में हार के वो जा रहा है कोई शबे गम गुजार के तुझसे भी दिल फरेब है गम रोजगार के. So the afflictions of unemployment are worse than these pangs of romantic yearning. And part of what I'm trying to do really by drawing on these structures and by furthering them in this moment, is to say that I'm making a case for, we go back to syncretism, making a case for an already existing lineage and genealogy of descent within the quote-unquote traditional. I mean, was Malaka Bai a radical Muslim, or was she a traditional Muslim? She was both. She was completely subversive and radical, promoting her kind of extramarital love affairs through her poetry, talking about female desire, very powerfully saying, I want to tear off this veil that is between me and my beloved, which can be interpreted as a critique of patriarchy, as a critique of, of Ashrafia sort of sensibility, which prohibits the demi-monde or semi-respectable people from entering into polite society. And you can really, if you situate it inside a social biographical milieu, you can take it to mean so many things. And I know now young women singers in New York City who are singing Malaka Bai's poetry to articulate their own particular experiences of marginality.
I want to turn back to the sort of, homoerotic themes, but not just that, right? Because we're talking about a situation in which the erotic, especially when it's queer, and also when it's female, right? So like something that the Aurat March, for instance, has just recently highlighted in terms of just like the bodily autonomy, right? Like even that brings so much like sexualization to TV anchors who are going to ask ridiculous questions of female activists. All those undercurrents of eroticism are I think very obvious in your work. So I want to ask, how important, why is that so important to you, and how is it so important to you in a status quo where it feels so incredibly dangerous to do that?
Well, look, I just did a rendition of the Ghazal Khabare Tahayyure Ishq Sun Junura Hana Pari Rahi, which is in some ways the kind of origin point of the Ghazal as we know it, in the form that we know it. As an 18th century ghazal written by Siraj Aurangabadi. It's a famous ghazal. Farida Abu Muhammad sing it. Abda Parveen performs it. But what most people don't talk about is the life of the poet who wrote this iconic poem that lives with us today. And I read a book recently that was recommended to me by Ali Ahsani, by Scott. What's his name? I'm going to find the scholar's name and send it to you. But it's a book about these two poets, Siraj Aurangabadi and Malaka Bai Chanda, the woman courtesan poet. And it's about eros. It's about exactly this. It's about the erotic within the ghazal. And he situates their work sort of inside their social and personal milieu. So what I did not know, and I now know, and we made a little documentary about this too, is that Siraj Aurangabadi, as a young man, as a young Muslim noble, fell in love with a Hindu soldier, and then seemed to have spent some time with him in the throes of romance, and was then abandoned, and then became a kind of outcast because he went around telling the world about his experience of love. And everybody shunned him, his family included. They kind of, his father apparently put him in chains for a while, and then he broke free. Still a very young man. I think he was only about 20 or so when all of this happened. But he took shelter in a Sufi dargah, but of course, right? And a Peer saw him and found him and gave him shelter. And then he kind of channeled his pain and his angst and his suffering and his ecstasy and agony into the writing of ghazal poetry, which was indirectly about his experience, but written in the language of metaphor. And people would come from hundreds of miles away to see him recite these ghazals. And he became quite a sort of, partly because it was a tamasha and partly because he was so good at what he did. He became a kind of live act. And what's so interesting is that you'll find these kinds of stories of subversive desire throughout, right? So not just in the realm of poetry, but also, and especially perhaps in the realm of singers, right? When you think about it, so many of the Ghazal singers who've made the form, a vital musical form for 200 years have been women singers. And many of them have come from the sort of matrilineal gharanas of women singers, who then there's a whole host of tricky words that now we use in India, Pakistan. So, for example, one word that is used is tawaif, right? Which now has a very negative and particular connotation. It means now it just, I think most people assume it means like a sex worker, which is not what it meant even 40 years ago, and certainly not what it meant 100 years ago. I think there's a lot of scholarship about this, about how these words have undergone Peterization over the years. But it usually just meant a woman who was mobile, who was visible, who was not in parda, right? Does that mean that she was not respectable? No, it doesn't mean that she was a woman of ill repute, right? These are actually more recent distinctions that we've had to make in the shadow of oppressive, national programs. But a lot of these people, the poets as well as the musicians, who have peddled and provided this, this body of work, which is simultaneously erotic and spiritual, which is simultaneously personal and political, which is at once Sharif seeming and also, not so Sharif seeming, which also destabilizes the concept of the respectable and what is allowed, what is permitted, which is constantly playing with the idea of permission. I find it helpful for two reasons. One, because I think it certainly allows me to peddle and put forth and convey, if not disclose, shall we say, alternative perspectives, alternative experiences of desire, of longing, of union and separation, of feeling that you belong in a crowd, and also feeling that you may harbor. So I think that in sort of highly censored sort of societies where people are not allowed to talk about things, I think that metaphor always has been and continues to be a very powerful tool of promoting perspectives that are otherwise not permitted.
Thank you so much, Ali, for being with us. We've taken enough of your time, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.